When the Galactic Concordance discovered Earth, we expected another simple conquest. Primitive technology, no faster than light travel, and laughably outdated weapons. So we granted them 72 hours to surrender. What we did not expect was a human ambassador smiling at us and saying, "You misunderstand. It is you who should surrender." I had spent most of my career watching civilizations collapse the moment they understood what the Galactic Concordance truly was. Our fleets did not negotiate. We delivered terms, and those terms were accepted. 47 worlds had already learned that lesson the hard way. Entire star systems had bowed to our authority without firing a single shot, because resistance was pointless against a force that had ruled the galaxy for centuries. When Earth appeared on our exploration charts, I assumed it would be no different. The intelligence reports described humanity as a developing species with limited space travel and no operational faster-than-light technology. Their weapons were primitive compared to ours, their fleets small, and their political systems fractured into dozens of competing governments. Everything about the data suggested that Earth would fold quickly once our ultimatum was delivered. The Council agreed unanimously that the planet would be absorbed into the Concordance within days. Our protocol was simple. A fleet would arrive in orbit, a message would be transmitted to the planetary governments, and the inhabitants would be given 3 days to accept Concordance authority. In most cases, the deadline was unnecessary, because the sight of our warships alone convinced them to surrender. That is why none of us expected the response that came from Earth. Instead of panic or desperate pleas for mercy, the humans requested a diplomatic meeting. The request surprised the Council. Conquered species sometimes begged for negotiations, but the tone of the human message was not desperate. It was calm, almost formal, as if they believed they were speaking to equals rather than an empire capable of erasing their world. After some discussion, the Council allowed the meeting. We assumed it would simply accelerate their surrender. 3 days later, the human ambassador arrived at our orbital command station. Her name was Ambassador Victoria Grant. She entered the Council chamber alone, without guards or advisors. Compared to the towering members of the Concordance, she looked small and physically unimpressive. Humans lacked natural armor, claws, or enhanced musculature. By every known biological measure, they were fragile creatures. Yet the ambassador walked into a room filled with the most powerful commanders in 7 sectors and showed no sign of fear. That was the first moment I realized something about this situation was different. Most species trembled during their first encounter with the Concordance leadership. Some could barely speak when delivering their surrender statements. Ambassador Grant, however, stepped to the center of the chamber, folded her hands calmly behind her back, and examined the Council as if she were the one evaluating us. High Commander Ralvik delivered the standard declaration. Earth had been identified as a candidate world for integration into the Galactic Concordance. Humanity had 72 hours to surrender peacefully and accept administrative control. If they refused, military action would follow immediately. The chamber fell silent as the translation systems repeated the message in the human language. Ambassador Grant listened carefully, her expression neutral. When the translation finished, she did something none of us expected. She smiled. It was not the nervous smile of someone facing inevitable defeat. It was calm, confident, and strangely amused. Then she spoke in a steady voice that carried clearly across the chamber. "You misunderstand the situation," she said. Several Council members shifted in their seats. No conquered species had ever begun negotiations by correcting the Concordance. The ambassador continued without hesitation. She explained that Earth had carefully reviewed our ultimatum and our fleet's capabilities. Humanity, she said, understood exactly what the Concordance believed it was capable of doing. But according to her, Our analysis of Earth contained a very serious mistake. High Commander Ralvek demanded clarification. Ambassador Grant looked directly at him, the faint smile still on her face. "You gave Earth 3 days to surrender," she said calmly, "but if you attempt to attack our world, you will not last 3 seconds." For several seconds after the translator repeated her statement, the council chamber remained completely silent. It was not the silence of fear or uncertainty. It was the silence of disbelief. No species had ever spoken to the Galactic Concordance in such a manner, especially not one that had barely begun exploring its own star system. I studied the human ambassador carefully, expecting to see signs of nervousness or desperation, but her posture remained relaxed and composed, as if she had just delivered a routine diplomatic observation, rather than a direct challenge to the most powerful military authority in the galaxy. Then the chamber erupted with laughter. Several commanders leaned back in their seats, their voices echoing across the hall as they reacted to what they assumed was a desperate bluff. To them, the idea that a pre-FTL civilization could threaten a Concordance fleet was beyond absurd. Our armadas carried weapons capable of sterilizing entire planets. Our shields could withstand bombardment that would shatter moons. Humanity, according to every intelligence report we possessed, had nothing remotely comparable. High Commander Ralvik allowed the laughter to continue for a moment before raising one massive clawed hand to restore order. His gaze remained fixed on the human ambassador, though the amusement in his expression had not faded. In a calm but unmistakably condescending tone, he asked Ambassador Grant if she truly understood who she was speaking to. The Concordance, he reminded her, had ruled interstellar space for centuries and commanded fleets that had subdued dozens of advanced civilizations. Ambassador Grant did not appear intimidated by the reminder. She listened politely while the translation systems relayed the commander's words, then nodded once in acknowledgement. Her expression remained thoughtful rather than defensive, as though she were listening to a presentation that confirmed information she already knew. When the translation finished, she responded in the same measured voice she had used before. She explained that humanity was fully aware of the Concordance's reputation and its long record of conquests. In fact, she said, human analysts had spent the last several hours reviewing the available data about Concordance military operations, including fleet composition, tactical doctrine, and known weapon systems. According to her, the analysis confirmed what humanity had suspected the moment our fleet entered their system. The Concordance believed it was facing a primitive species that had no realistic ability to resist. Ambassador Grant calmly stated that this assumption was incorrect. The council members exchanged confused glances as the translator repeated her words. Primitive species sometimes attempted to exaggerate their capabilities in a final attempt to delay conquest, but the ambassador's tone lacked the urgency or emotional strain that usually accompanied such efforts. Instead, she spoke with the quiet certainty of someone presenting a technical report rather than arguing for the survival of her species. High Commander Ralvek leaned forward slightly and demanded that she explain exactly what humanity believed. We had misunderstood. His patience was beginning to fade, though there was still a trace of curiosity in his voice. The ambassador had clearly captured the council's attention, if only because her confidence seemed so completely disconnected from the reality of the situation. Ambassador Grant clasped her hands in front of her and began to answer. She explained that the Concordance had correctly identified Earth as a relatively young interstellar civilization. Humanity had not yet developed faster-than-light drives, and their exploration of nearby space was limited. However, she continued, technological development in a single field was not the only measure of a civilization's capabilities. Humanity, she said, had spent centuries perfecting something else entirely. The council listened with growing impatience. as she carefully explained that Earth was not a peaceful world that had slowly evolved under stable conditions. Human history was filled with conflict, competition, and constant technological innovation, driven by the need to survive against both environmental threats and other humans. Over thousands of years, those pressures had forced humanity to become extremely creative when it came to warfare and defense. Several commanders dismissed the explanation immediately. Many species possessed violent histories before joining the Concordance, and none of them had been able to challenge our authority once our fleets arrived. High Commander Ralvik pointed this out bluntly, reminding the ambassador that primitive war experience meant very little against weapons capable of destroying entire continents from orbit. Ambassador Grant acknowledged the point with another small nod, as if she had expected the objection. She then calmly explained that humanity did not intend to fight the Concordance using conventional fleet engagements or direct military parity. Instead, she said, the human response to the ultimatum had focused on a different question entirely. The question was not how humanity could defeat the Concordance. The question was how quickly the Concordance could be defeated if it attempted to attack Earth. When the translator finished repeating that statement, the chamber grew quiet again. The laughter had faded, replaced by a more cautious silence. The ambassador's words were still outrageous, but the steady confidence with which she delivered them made it difficult to dismiss them entirely as empty threats. High Commander Ralvik finally asked the obvious question. If humanity truly believed it possessed such power, he demanded to know why their species had not expanded across the galaxy already. Ambassador Grant's smile returned. Calm and almost sympathetic. She explained that humanity had spent most of its history preparing for enemies far more dangerous than the Galactic Concordance. The statement caused another ripple of confusion across the council chamber. Several commanders leaned toward one another, exchanging quiet remarks while the translation systems repeated the ambassador's words. The idea that a species as technologically limited as humanity had spent centuries preparing for enemies more dangerous than the Galactic Concordance seemed completely irrational. Our empire had dominated interstellar space for generations. No rival power capable of threatening us had ever been recorded, and no developing civilization had the resources to challenge a fleet of our size. High Commander Ralvik studied the human ambassador carefully before responding. His expression had shifted from open amusement to something more analytical. He asked Ambassador Grant to clarify exactly what kind of enemies humanity had supposedly been preparing for. If Earth had been anticipating contact with powerful extraterrestrial forces, he wanted to know how a species without faster-than-light travel could possibly have gathered enough information to prepare for such encounters. Ambassador Grant did not appear offended by the question. She simply explained that humanity had never required evidence of extraterrestrial empires to begin planning for them. Long before their species left their own planet, human scientists and strategists had considered the possibility that intelligent life might exist elsewhere in the universe. From that moment forward, many of their research institutions had begun examining what would happen if Earth eventually encountered civilizations far more advanced than itself. The council listened with cautious curiosity as the translator carried her explanation across the chamber. According to the ambassador, human thinkers had spent centuries debating the same scenario that was now unfolding in front of us. They had imagined fleets arriving from distant stars, demanding submission from a young civilization that had barely reached its own orbit. The possibility had been treated not as science fiction, but as a strategic problem that needed solutions. Several commanders began to show visible impatience. Preparing theoretical plans for a distant threat was common among developing societies, but those plans rarely survived first contact with a true interstellar empire. High Commander Ralvik pointed out that speculation and imagination did not translate into practical defenses against a fleet capable of planetary bombardment. The Concordance had encountered dozens of species that believed they possessed secret advantages, and every one of them had been proven wrong. Ambassador Grant listened to the objection without interrupting. When the translation finished, she calmly acknowledged that many civilizations probably had similar discussions before joining the wider galactic community. However, she explained that humanity had approached the problem in a slightly different way. Instead of assuming that alien contact would be peaceful, human strategists had assumed the worst possible scenario. They had assumed that the first extraterrestrial civilization humanity encountered might attempt to conquer them. Because of that assumption, generations of human researchers had explored unconventional strategies for defending a technologically weaker world against a vastly superior interstellar power. They studied theoretical physics, advanced engineering concepts, and large-scale defensive systems that could compensate for humanity's lack of a traditional space fleet. Most of those projects had remained experimental for decades, but the research had never stopped. High Commander Ralvik asked the obvious question that had begun circulating among the council members. If humanity had spent centuries studying hypothetical alien invasions, why had the Concordance never detected any unusual technological developments within their system? Our survey probes had reported nothing that suggested the presence of weapons capable of threatening an interstellar fleet. Ambassador Grant responded with the same calm composure she had shown since the beginning of the meeting. She explained that the Concordance surveys had not detected anything unusual because humanity had never built a conventional military force designed to fight wars in open space. Instead, she said, nearly all of their defensive research had focused on a single strategic objective: ensuring that any hostile fleet entering Earth's system would be unable to leave it. The translation produced another wave of uneasy murmurs across the chamber. The concept itself was not impossible. Advanced civilizations sometimes deployed containment technologies around strategically important systems. However, such systems required enormous resources and decades of construction. According to every record we possessed, humanity did not have the industrial capacity to build anything on that scale. High Commander Ralvik stated this clearly. He reminded the ambassador that Concordance sensors had mapped the entire solar system. During the fleet's approach, aside from a few orbital stations and scattered exploration vessels, there was no evidence of a defensive network capable of trapping a war fleet. Ambassador Grant nodded again, as though confirming a detail that had already been expected. She explained that the Concordance scans were completely accurate. There were no visible defensive networks surrounding Earth, no large weapon platforms hidden among the outer planets, and no military fleets waiting to ambush the Concordance armada. Humanity had intentionally avoided building anything that could be detected by conventional reconnaissance systems. The council waited as the translator finished repeating her words. Then Ambassador Grant calmly explained that humanity's primary defensive system was not located in space at all. Instead, it was embedded deep within the structure of their own star system, integrated into infrastructure that had existed long before the Concordance ever discovered Earth. Several commanders leaned forward at once. Their attention suddenly sharpened. Ambassador Grant met their gaze and spoke with quiet certainty. She told the council that the moment the Concordance fleet crossed a specific boundary within the solar system, a sequence of automated systems had already been activated. According to her, those systems had been designed for a single purpose: to neutralize any hostile force attempting to threaten Earth. High Commander Ralvik demanded immediate clarification. The ambassador paused briefly, as if considering how to phrase her explanation. Then she calmly said that humanity's defensive protocol had just entered its final stage. The council chamber became noticeably quieter after the translation finished repeating her words. Several commanders who had previously shown open amusement were now watching the human ambassador with renewed attention. High Commander Ralvik remained silent for several seconds, studying her expression carefully as if searching for some sign that this entire presentation was an elaborate bluff. However, Ambassador Grant's posture had not changed since the meeting began. She stood calmly in the center of the chamber, her hands loosely clasped and her gaze steady, as though she were describing an ordinary procedural matter rather than the activation of a defensive system capable of threatening an entire Concordance fleet. Ralvik eventually asked the question that had begun circulating through the minds of every officer present. He wanted to know exactly what kind of system the ambassador was referring to. The Concordance had conducted extensive sensor sweeps of the entire solar system during its approach. Those scans had revealed asteroid belts, several gas giants, and a collection of small human installations scattered around their inner planets. There had been no evidence of hidden weapon arrays or gravitational projectors powerful enough to trap an armada. If humanity possessed some form of planetary defense network, it had remained completely invisible to our reconnaissance systems. Ambassador Grant listened attentively while the translation carried the commander's question across the chamber. When the message finished, she nodded once and explained that the Concordance scans had been accurate within the limits of their detection methods. Humanity had deliberately designed its defensive infrastructure to appear harmless to standard long-range reconnaissance. Most of the components involved were embedded within structures that Concordance analysts had likely dismissed as routine industrial facilities or astronomical research platforms. The council members exchanged uneasy glances as her explanation continued. According to the ambassador, those installations were part of a distributed system that had been developed gradually over many decades. Each structure by itself appeared insignificant and incapable of military application. However, when connected through a unified control network, they formed a coordinated array capable of manipulating conditions across large portions of the solar system. High Commander Ralvik interrupted at that point, pointing out that large-scale manipulation of stellar environments required technology far beyond what humanity should have possessed. Even advanced civilizations required enormous energy resources to produce effects capable of threatening a fleet protected by modern shields. From everything our probes had reported, Earth's industrial output was nowhere near the level required to construct such a system. Ambassador Grant acknowledged that observation calmly. She explained that the Concordance had evaluated humanity's capabilities by measuring only the technologies normally associated with interstellar expansion, because humanity had not yet developed faster than light travel. Our analysts had assumed their overall scientific progress was limited. In reality, she said, most of Earth's research funding for the last century had been directed toward fields that rarely appeared in CONVENTIONL military assessments. Human scientists had focused heavily on energy production, stellar physics, and gravitational engineering. Much of that work had originally been justified as part of long-term plans for planetary defense against natural cosmic threats such as asteroid impacts or solar instability. Over time, however, those same technologies had been adapted for a secondary purpose that humanity rarely discussed openly, preparing for the possibility that an advanced extraterrestrial power might someday attempt to dominate their world. Several commanders attempted to dismiss the explanation, but the atmosphere in the chamber had shifted noticeably. The ambassador's calm delivery and precise technical language no longer sounded like the empty boasting we had initially assumed. Instead, she spoke with the quiet confidence of someone describing systems that had already been tested and verified. High Commander Ralvik asked her to explain exactly what she meant when she claimed the Concordance fleet had already triggered the final stage of this defensive protocol. Ambassador Grant responded by explaining that the system had been designed to activate automatically whenever a large concentration of advanced starships entered a specific region of the solar system. That boundary had been crossed shortly after the Concordance Armada completed its orbital formation near Earth. From that moment forward, a sequence of pre-programmed operations had begun running across the network of installations scattered throughout the system. Each phase of the protocol prepared the environment for the next stage, gradually adjusting gravitational conditions and energy distributions in ways that would remain difficult to detect without extremely specialized instruments. High Commander Ralvek's expression hardened as he listened to the explanation. He demanded to know exactly what effect those operations were supposed to produce. Ambassador Grant met his gaze steadily and replied that the goal of the protocol was simple. Humanity had never intended to defeat a superior fleet through direct combat. Instead, their strategy focused on altering the physical environment of the battlefield itself until the invading force could no longer operate within it. She then added, in the same calm tone she had used since the beginning of the meeting, that the Concordance fleet was currently positioned at the exact center of the region, where those environmental changes would reach their peak intensity. According to her calculations, the final stage of the defensive system would become fully active within a matter of seconds. The council chamber remained silent for a moment after the translator finished repeating her statement. Several commanders shifted uneasily in their seats while tactical officers quietly checked the data feeds appearing on their personal consoles. Until that moment, the ambassador's claims had sounded like elaborate speculation, but the possibility that a large-scale system had already been activated forced the council to treat her words with greater caution. High Commander Ralvek maintained his composed posture, though the confidence that had filled the chamber earlier had begun to fade. He ordered the fleet's sensor division to WISE perform an immediate full-spectrum analysis of the surrounding region of space. Within seconds, streams of telemetry began appearing across the holographic displays positioned along the chamber walls. At first, the readings appeared normal. Local gravitational conditions matched the expected values for Earth's solar system, and there were no detectable energy surges that might indicate the activation of a powerful weapon array. Several commanders exchanged relieved looks, interpreting the results as confirmation that the ambassador's warning had been nothing more than a terre diplomatic bluff. Ambassador Grant watched the activity calmly while the officers examined their data. She made no attempt to interrupt or challenge their conclusions, standing quietly as the council reviewed the sensor reports. When the preliminary scan results were announced, High Commander Ralvek turned his attention back toward her with a faint trace of irritation. He pointed out that the Concordance fleet was equipped with some of the most advanced detection systems in known space, and none of them had identified any unusual activity within the solar system. The ambassador listened respectfully while the translation repeated his statement. When it finished, she simply asked the commander which type of sensors his officers were currently using to monitor the environment around their ships. Ralvek appeared slightly puzzled by the question, but answered without hesitation. The fleet had deployed standard gravitational mapping arrays, particle density scanners, and wide-spectrum energy detectors capable of identifying almost any large-scale technological operation. Ambassador Grant nodded thoughtfully, as though confirming a detail she had already expected. She explained that those sensors were perfectly suited for detecting conventional military systems such as weapon platforms, shield generators, or energy cannons. However, she added that humanity's defensive network had not been designed to operate like any traditional weapon system. Instead of generating sudden bursts of detectable energy, the system functioned by making extremely gradual adjustments to the natural forces already present within the solar system. Several officers leaned forward at that explanation, their expressions sharpening with concern. The ambassador calmly elaborated that the installations scattered throughout the system were capable of influencing gravitational interactions on a very small scale. Individually, those adjustments were insignificant and nearly impossible to detect against the background fluctuations that occurred naturally within any stellar environment. When synchronized across dozens of separate stations, however, the combined effect could become far more substantial. High Commander Ralvik asked her to clarify exactly what kind of effect she was describing. Ambassador Grant responded by explaining that the defensive protocol did not attempt to destroy an invading fleet directly. Instead, its purpose was to manipulate the surrounding gravitational field until the conditions required for faster-than-light navigation became unstable. If those conditions changed even slightly, advanced starships could find their navigation systems disrupted or their drives temporarily disabled. The translation repeated her words slowly across the chamber, and the silence that followed was far more tense than before. The ability to interfere with faster-than-light systems would not necessarily destroy the Concordance fleet, but it would trap every vessel inside the solar system until the disruption ended. For an empire accustomed to overwhelming mobility and rapid deployment across multiple sectors, such confinement represented a serious strategic disadvantage. High Commander Ralvik immediately ordered another round of sensor checks, this time focusing specifically on minute fluctuations in gravitational curvature. As the technicians began examining their instruments more closely, several subtle irregularities started appearing within the data streams. The variations were small enough that they might normally have been dismissed as natural background noise, but when plotted across multiple locations, they revealed a pattern that slowly spread across the region where the Concordance fleet had assembled. A quiet murmur moved through the council as the pattern became clearer. Ambassador Grant watched their reactions without any sign of triumph or hostility. She simply explained that the system had been designed to operate gradually in order to avoid detection until it reached a critical threshold. According to her calculations, the gravitational distortions would soon reach a level where faster-than-light drives would no longer function safely anywhere within the inner portion of the solar system. High Commander Ralvik demanded to know how long the disruption would last. Ambassador Grant answered calmly that the network could maintain those conditions indefinitely as long as the installations remained intact. She then reminded the Council that Earth's defenses had never been intended to fight a direct battle against an invading armada. Humanity's strategy had always been based on forcing a technologically superior enemy to operate under restrictions that eliminated its greatest advantage. The commander stared at her for several seconds before asking the most pressing question of all. If the Concordance fleet was truly trapped inside the system, he wanted to know what the human government expected to gain from such a maneuver. Ambassador Grant's expression remained composed as she responded. She explained that humanity did not intend to destroy the Concordance fleet at all. The purpose of the defensive protocol was simply to demonstrate that Earth could not be conquered by intimidation alone. Then she added, with the same calm certainty she had shown since entering the chamber, that the gravitational disruption would reach full strength in approximately 3 seconds. The council chamber fell into a heavy silence after the translator finished repeating her final sentence. For the first time since the meeting began, several Concordance commanders were no longer focused on the ambassador, but on the tactical data streams hovering above their consoles. The gravitational fluctuation reports were still appearing in slow, irregular patterns, and the technicians monitoring the fleet's navigation systems had begun speaking rapidly among themselves as they attempted to interpret the unusual readings. High Commander Ralvik immediately demanded a status report from the navigation division. Within seconds, one of the fleet officers responded that several ships had already initiated diagnostic procedures on their faster-than-light drives. At first, the issue appeared minor, something that could have been caused by temporary sensor interference or minor stellar radiation distortions. However, as additional data arrived from the outer formations of the fleet, it became increasingly clear that the same anomalies were appearing across every vessel positioned within Earth's orbital region. The commander ordered an immediate test jump from one of the escort cruisers stationed near the outer perimeter of the formation. If the ship could successfully initiate its faster-than-light drive, the ambassador's claims would collapse instantly. The council watched in tense silence as the order was transmitted through the fleet command network. Moments later, the cruiser's captain confirmed that the jump sequence had begun and that the ship's navigation computer was preparing the necessary calculations for transition. For several seconds, the chamber remained completely still while everyone waited for the result. Then the tactical display flashed with a warning signal. The cruiser's jump attempt had been aborted automatically by its own safety protocols. According to the report that followed, the navigation computer had detected unstable gravitational conditions that made faster-than-light travel extremely dangerous. If the vessel had attempted to force the transition, the resulting miscalculation could have scattered the ship across multiple points in space. A wave of quiet alarm moved through the chamber as additional ships reported the same problem. One after another, captains attempted to initiate test jumps and received identical warnings from their navigation systems. The gravitational irregularities surrounding the fleet were subtle but widespread, forming a shifting field that prevented stable calculations for faster-than-light travel. Even the most advanced Concordance vessels were unable to generate a safe escape trajectory. High Commander Ralvik's attention slowly returned to the human ambassador standing in the center of the room. For the first time since the meeting began, there was no trace of amusement in his expression. Ambassador Grant met his gaze calmly, her posture unchanged as the reports continued appearing across the chamber displays. She explained quietly that the disruption field had now reached operational stability. The network of installations scattered throughout the solar system was maintaining a continuous series of gravitational adjustments that would prevent any Concordance vessel from performing a faster-than-light jump within the region. According to her, the system had been tested many times using unmanned probes and remote platforms before it was ever activated against a real fleet. Several council members demanded to know whether the effect could be countered by simply destroying the installations responsible for generating it. Ambassador Grant acknowledged that such an attempt might eventually succeed if the fleet managed to locate and eliminate every component of the network. However, she also explained that the installations were widely distributed across the solar system and hidden within facilities that resembled civilian infrastructure. Even if the Concordance began a systematic search immediately, the process could take months. High Commander Ralvik asked the next question in a much more controlled tone than before. If humanity had already succeeded in trapping the Concordance fleet inside their system, he wanted to know why they had not launched an attack while the ships were vulnerable. From a purely strategic perspective, this would have been the logical moment to attempt destroying an enemy armada. Ambassador Grant responded that humanity had never intended to destroy the fleet. The purpose of the defensive protocol had always been deterrence rather than retaliation. By demonstrating that even a technologically superior empire could be immobilized within Earth's territory, the human government hoped to make further attempts at conquest unnecessary. She reminded the Council that the Concordance had originally given Earth 3 days to surrender peacefully. Humanity had simply chosen to answer that ultimatum with a demonstration of its own capabilities. If the Concordance leadership decided to withdraw its demand and recognize Earth as an independent civilization, the gravitational disruption would be deactivated and the fleet would be free to depart. The chamber remained quiet for several seconds while the translation finished repeating her explanation. High Commander Ralvek looked around at the assembled council members before slowly returning his attention to the ambassador. You claim our fleet will not last 3 seconds if we attack your world, he said carefully. Yet, you have done nothing to destroy us. Ambassador Grant gave a small, almost polite smile. That was never a threat of destruction, she replied calmly. It was simply the amount of time required for your fleet to lose the ability to leave our system. Thus, the tactical display above the chamber confirmed her statement. The final wave of gravitational distortions had just stabilized, and every faster-than-light drive within the Concordance Armada had been automatically locked by its safety systems. The human ambassador had been correct. It had taken exactly 3 seconds. The realization settled across the chamber with a weight that none of the commanders could ignore. The tactical display continued streaming confirmation reports from every division of the fleet, and each message carried the same conclusion: navigation systems were locked. Jump calculations were impossible. Every ship in the Concordance Armada was now effectively confined to the inner region of the solar system. What had been intended as a simple demonstration of overwhelming force had turned into a situation none of the council members had ever experienced before. High Commander Ralvek remained silent for a long moment, studying the human ambassador, while the officers around him continued examining their consoles. For centuries, the Concordance had relied on the same fundamental advantage: mobility. Their fleets could appear anywhere in known space with little warning, deliver an ultimatum, and depart just as quickly if negotiations failed. That ability had allowed the Empire to maintain control across dozens of systems. Now, for the first time, that advantage had been removed. Ambassador Grant waited patiently while the Council processed the situation. She did not appear triumphant or hostile, only composed and attentive. When Ralvek finally spoke again, his tone had changed noticeably. The condescension that had marked his earlier statements was gone, replaced by a much more deliberate and cautious voice. He asked the ambassador whether the gravitational network could truly be disabled if the Concordance chose to withdraw its ultimatum and depart peacefully. The ambassador confirmed that it could. She explained that the installations maintaining the disruption field were operating under automated instructions that could be reversed at any time by human authorities. If the Concordance formally recognized Earth's sovereignty and canceled its demand for surrender, the network would gradually return the solar system to normal gravitational conditions. Once that happened, faster-than-light navigation would function normally again, and the fleet would be free to leave. Several council members exchanged quiet remarks while the translation systems carried her explanation across the chamber. It was clear that none of them had expected negotiations to proceed in this direction. The Concordance had arrived at Earth, believing it was dealing with a primitive civilization that could be intimidated into submission within hours. Instead, they had encountered a species that had spent generations preparing for exactly this type of encounter. High Commander Ralvek eventually addressed the council in a low voice, asking for their assessments. The responses that followed were cautious but consistent. Attempting to destroy Earth's hidden installations would require a lengthy search across an unfamiliar star system, while the fleet remained unable to perform faster-than-light maneuvers. Even if the network could eventually be dismantled, the process would expose the Armada to constant risk and consume enormous resources. In contrast, accepting the ambassador's proposal would resolve the situation immediately. Ralvek turned back toward Ambassador Grant once the brief consultation ended. The chamber had grown quiet again, every commander waiting for the decision that would determine the outcome of the encounter. The High Commander's posture remained dignified, but the authority behind his voice carried a new sense of restraint. He stated that the Galactic Concordance had not expected such resistance from a species at humanity's stage of development. However, the evidence presented during the meeting had demonstrated that Earth possessed defensive capabilities far beyond what our intelligence reports had predicted. In light of that information, he announced that the Concordance would reconsider its original ultimatum. Ambassador Grant listened without interrupting as the translation repeated his words. When the message finished, she inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. Ralvek then declared that the Concordance fleet would withdraw its demand for Earth's surrender and recognize the planet as an independent civilization within the galactic community. Formal diplomatic negotiations could continue at a later time under more cooperative circumstances. For the first time since the meeting began, the faint smile returned to the ambassador's face. She thanked the Council for its decision and assured them that the human government would deactivate the disruption network as soon as the official withdrawal order was transmitted to the fleet. The process would take several minutes to complete, after which normal navigation conditions would gradually return. The tension in the chambers slowly began to ease as officers confirmed that the ambassador's statement had already been relayed to the command authorities on Earth. Within moments, the gravitational fluctuation readings started to weaken, indicating that the automated systems maintaining the disruption field were beginning their shutdown sequence. High. Commander Ralvek watched the changing sensor reports in silence before finally turning his attention back to the human ambassador. "You prepared all of this," he said slowly, "for a threat that had never appeared before." Ambassador Grant gave a small nod. "Human history taught us something important," she replied calmly. "When you live in a dangerous universe, you prepare long before the danger arrives." Outside the station's observation ports, the Concordance fleet remained suspended above Earth's blue horizon, while the last traces of the gravitational disruption faded from the surrounding space. Within a few minutes, their navigation systems would be free to operate again, and the armada that had arrived expecting conquest would depart with a very different understanding of humanity. The galaxy had believed Earth was an unprotected world. Now it knew better.